and the media must also follow the use of such resources, so that if we are seeing an increase, we must see a corresponding improvement in the conditions in the prisons as well. And that is something that we can do more about. And such efforts, such as highlighting the cases of such reports, and it does no credit to the name of Ghana. We are used as an example to the rest of the continent. And there are places in Africa who have less resources than we do, but provide slightly better conditions than we do. And so we should aim at monitoring the use of such resources, and based on that, there can be the advocacy for the allocation of more resources when there's an improvement in the national cake as well for such people.
Right. And I mean, you look at our prisons, and what we want to do is build more prisons. Is that the best thing we can do?
Ideally, that's not the best situation, and we would expect that, especially when they are not handling the custody of people in the prisons very well. Half of the people in the prisons are not supposed to be there anyway. And so you don't need more prisons if you are going to manage the prisons that you have effectively, and also to be more creative about sentencing, which would require an amendment of our Criminal and Other Offences Act, so that you can have more creative imposition of sentences which are beneficial to society. And if you observe, the use of custodial sentences, detention, is not something which was really common in our traditional culture. There were ways in which you were made to pacify the victims of your offense. And these are ways that we can return to. We don't need to swallow hook, line, and sinker everything that was brought to us and completely ignore. There are ways that people can work to pacify the victims of their crimes. And most crimes have victims, so that you don't have too many people in the prisons who are not being useful to anybody and who are just being degraded. Sometimes the process of even being asked to work in pacification of the victims of your crimes has a way of reforming you. And there are wonderful stories of people who have been reformed by such services. So I think if we are going to look more creatively and think out of the box when it comes to prison service and see them more as correctional services, we are likely to have a depopulation of our prisons, which would then not necessitate the building of more prisons. But while we have this system of overcrowding, you really can't say that no building of prisons should go on.
But I think also I should mention the fact that the prison service recently has developed its system to some extent. It's introduced various forms of education within the system. But what we are bedeviled with is getting that limited resource to the prisons, and it trickling down to every prisoner in the prisons, because we have some of them right in the BEC, some of them right in WASI, some of them taking a vocational education, some of them taking a computer training, and I was telling you about the agric module as well. And you have all this, but you have a rapporteur come into your country and tell you that something is wrong. Why would they come into the country in the first place?
We are signatories to the international treaties which give them the right to come to this country and carry out such inspections, and the UN has rapporteurs for specific countries and also rapporteurs for some thematic areas. So it could be for prisons, for example, and so they can go around anywhere in the world. If a country is problematic, then you have a rapporteur in charge of that country. Our country has not been identified as being that problematic, so this report is not only targeting our country. There are reports which they issue on various countries as they travel around the world on their duties to ensure that countries are complying with their international obligations under those treaties. So it's not a specific targeting of Ghana. And indeed, as you mentioned, I visited the female department of Nsawam prisons, and conditions there are quite laudable compared to other places. There's vocational training, and there isn't much congestion in the prisons. It's a good example, and there are such good examples. But if we actually carry that model forward and stop using resources as an excuse, then we can actually have better, and sometimes there are donations outside which are specifically targeted at such areas. We should have libraries, we should have more comfortable places for study in the prisons, so that many of them can aspire to something other than crime when they are released from the prisons. And in the prisons, you have a lot of time. You have a lot of time to train yourself to be better. And so we should make use of that time. It should not only be held time It should be a time for education, a time for learning a vocation, so that when people come out of the prisons, they can do something more useful with their life. So yes, there are bright spots, but we need to improve those more, because the dark spots are more than the bright spots.
I wanted to end the conversation, but something just came to mind. Torture was one of the elements that the United Nations report thought was ongoing on a large scale in our prisons. In the event that an officer has a very uncompromising, let me put it that way, a very difficult prisoner to deal with, what is the appropriate way in dealing with such a prisoner?
But there are ways, the prison officers and the police officers are trained in ways of restraining people. And often the use of torture is not to restrain people, it's just to inflict pain on them or to get them to make a confession. So the use of torture is not a substitute for actually exerting control over the prisoners. The very setup of the prison as an institution is meant to exercise that control. And also there are weapons and tools which assist them to control the prisoners. So torture is not a substitute for that. And like I mentioned, our Prison Service Act prohibits prison officers carrying out torture. Our Constitution also, under Article 15, prohibits the use of torture against any person at all, and actually specifically mentions whether arrested or detained, you cannot use torture on them.
So how does the prisons officer control that prisoner?
Well, usually they have sticks. If the prisoner is escaping, for example, which they can use to restrain them, usually they have handcuffs. That's an effective way of controlling prisoners. If a prisoner has his hands cuffed, there's nothing he can do to harm the prison officer. And you don't need torture for that. The handcuffs are designed for that purpose. So
because I'm thinking before you are able to get the cuffs on, there will be a scuffle of some sort.
Yeah, usually you may have more than one prison officer in charge of that. And so in the extreme cases where you may have such incidents, there are ways of controlling you. And even the use of corporal punishment is allowed under the Prison Service Act, but it's not supposed to go to the extent of torture.
All right, thank you very much, Dennis. It's been insightful talking to you. Dennis Armah is President, Human Rights Advocate, African Heights Foundation. We've been talking our prisons, how to improve it so we don't end up abusing that section of our population. You're watching News Desk. There's more ahead. Don't go away.